Your source for everything paranormal. ParaX. The views expressed and the opinions given by the individual host and their guests do not necessarily reflect those of ParaX, its affiliates, or its sponsors.
Exciting new novel by author Marla Brooks, Soul Connection, A Deadly Obsession. Two lost souls, ripped apart by murder in another century, find each other again in the present, only to discover that the murderer has followed them through time. Can their love save them, or will history repeat itself? Find out in this captivating new novel by Marla Brooks, Soul Connection, A Deadly Obsession. Available now on Amazon.com and at BarnesandNoble.com.
Merry meet and hail to all. Heed the words I now shall call. Live you must, and let to live. Fairly take, and fairly give. Do what thou will, if it harms none. By the magic of old, may it be done. Greet the days and greet the night, with joy and thanks for all delights. 9 woods in the cauldron go, as above, so below. Welcome to Stirring the Cauldron on the ParaX Radio Network. And now, here's your host, Marla Brooks.
Merry meet everybody, and welcome to Stirring the Cauldron. We've got a really interesting show in store for you tonight. We're going to be talking about a book called The Mirror of Magic by the late Kurt Seligman. And this is a really magical book for sure. Now, since I'm really no good at gathering EVPs, I won't be talking to the author from the other side, but we will be talking to Daniel Mack. Daniel is a teacher, a writer, an artist who works with the powers of natural materials to make furniture and sacred objects. He studies the work of Carl Jung and especially archetypal psychologist James Hillman, and he's been working on a book-like project for 20 years called The Casual Alchemist. It's about letting the process of making things be a portal to the creative unconscious. He has taught at the Omega Institute for 20 years and offers a weekly making meditations in his hometown of Warwick, New York. He's actively involved with surrealism as chairman of the Seligman Center in Sugarloaf, New York, which is the 55-acre homestead of the book's author. Now, the book, The Mirror of Magic, was originally published in 1948, and it's just been reissued as a collector's edition by Inner Traditions. So much to talk about. Let's get started. Daniel, welcome to the show.
Oh, happy to be here.
Oh, I'm happy you're here too, because I had to talk about this book. I mean, it's a gem, and I think I told you this, had the biggest grin on my face when it arrived, because it's a big, heavy hardback book, close to 500 pages. And in essence, it's the history of magic in the Western world. And we'll be getting into that soon enough. But for now, I think a good place to start this evening is for you to give a little bit of background on the author, Kurt Seligman.
Seligman was Swiss. He was born in 1900 in Basel, studied art for a while in Paris, and then his father said, "Oh, son, you must come home and run the furniture business." And dutiful son that he was, he left art school and went home for about 8 years and ran a furniture business. At which point he just said, I have to I have to leave. So he went back to Paris, and there he met a woman who's going to be his wife, Arlette Paraf, and she was a member of the Wildenstein family, who was a very famous kind of art dealer in Europe at that point. They fell in love, got married, and took a year to go on a honeymoon all around the world, which included the United States. They enjoyed coming to the United States and came back here in 1938 after the war as half an emigre from Nazi Germany and half kind of to do some business. And they settled in New York City. They kept an apartment in Paris, and they bought a little country house up near me here in Sugarloaf, New York, in 1942. So that's sort of the thumbnail. And they continued their traveling a lot. He was a very eclectic man, which we'll get into kind of the advantages of that and disadvantages. He was a bibliophile. He loved books. He loved going to flea markets and finding 15th and 16th century manuscripts. And we're all benefiting from that tonight because they actually created some of the images and some of the insights that he put into his book. His imagery that almost persisted throughout his life was very European, very heraldic. It was banners and knights and in sort of abstract forms, kind of spinning things, cyclonic figures. And he, even as an older man, he talked about how important as a boy these images were to him and how they stayed with him his entire life. So he was kind of a real Renaissance man. He was a teacher, a bibliophile, a farmer. He farmed up in Warwick, in Sugarloaf, New York, up near me. He called himself a biodynamic farmer, which we would now call permaculture.
Okay.
So that's a thumbnail introduction, Marla.
Okay. Well, we'll probably end up filling in some blanks as we go. But, I mean, he was also a surrealist as an artist. And for those who don't know what surrealism is, you kind of just sort of explained it in a way about swirly things. But how do you explain it when you're asked directly?
Surrealism, at least for the way I'm understanding it, is it really emerged out of World War I, and many of the men were soldiers at that point, and experienced just the horrors of war, especially World War I, with the gases and the first really technological war. And they just looked at the end of it and said, "What's this about?" So they fled in a certain way, and they wanted to flee and explore the unconscious. And surrealism and the various techniques, and we can talk about the dozen or so techniques that these people developed, were ways of getting in touch with other realities, the creative unconscious, the unconscious itself, the shadow. Freud was was in high practice at that point. This would be 1917, 1918. Jung was just emerging. So the psychological theories of the time were ripe for kind of fueling this surrealist interest in getting in touch with kind of the darker side of the world.
Mm-hmm. And I was doing some snooping around, and I found a video on YouTube that I watched that you did, a short video, and in it you said that surrealism is a form of alchemy. So how so?
Well, it's essentially a way of transforming experience, and that's really what alchemy does. It's taking one thing and turning it into another in service of a goal, and the goal is the secret of it is gold. But it's not gold. It's really discovering a higher calling, discovering your higher self. Mm-hmm. So all these techniques, these visual and sometimes poetic techniques, writing techniques that the surrealists developed, were ways of transforming their kind of raw human experience into something more developed, more insightful in terms of contact with the unconscious.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the goal. The goal of alchemy, here I'll put it very simply, the goal of alchemy is the discovery of the self, capital S.
There you go. That's the best way I've ever heard it explained. Thank you. Now, did Kirk Seligman have an interest in magic all his life? And I'm asking that because this is such a comprehensive book. And I mean, you would really have to feel the magic to be able to write as much and do as much research as he did. So is there any idea when his interest in magic came to be or how it came to be?
I've seen a picture of him as just a young lad he was probably 7 or 8, dressed up as a clown. And of course, the carnivals of Basel were, I'm hedging here. I can't really answer that definitively. Okay. I remember some of his writing and some of his lectures talking about a lifelong interest in this. And it matured with him, so it wasn't always a boyish kind of magic, but or the magic circle, which there's some very famous pictures of him in the 1940s creating magic circles and kind of entertaining his surrealist friends.
I did see that one, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I also read a quote of his that kind of talks about his interest, and I'll just read it verbatim. It says, "I'm an artist and I think as a painter. This is the true reason why magic attracts me, the completeness of the magical world. For an artwork should as well be complete in itself. There should be a manifoldness, a form, a variety held together by coordinating law similar to the magical world law spoken in clear words by the Babylonians, the Egyptian Magi's, and the Greek metaphysicists." I can't say that word. The Greek philosophers have not been able to break through the magic circle. The great axiom of magic, all is all and all is one, has haunted our civilized West and the Near East for thousands of years. So, yeah, that kind of explains what attracted, because there are so many similarities. And I'm just looking in the chat room right now, and you guys, if you have any questions or comments, to send them to me and we'll get them in. But Daniel, when you were just talking about what we were talking about before, Ceiling Cat said, well, that would explain the fascination with Mandela's and Eastern philosophy.
Yeah, he was he was a very academic person. He wrote a lot, he lectured, he taught his entire life, so that his curiosity pushed him to all, you're right, this is like an encyclopedia of magic. Mm-hmm. So it pushed him to discover what he felt himself, and he wanted to see how that sort of wore through history. But what's interesting here is your comment about alchemy. So alchemy is an active, you're actually doing something. It's technical, mm-hmm. It's intuitive, and it's spiritual. So there's 3 components at once, and artists work often like that themselves. They have to be technicians. My career was in rustic furniture for a while, so I had to know how to put chairs together from tree parts. So that was a technical thing, but then it's why you do it, and it's like the beauty of the form, and those are that would be the spiritual and the intuitive parts of it. And one very simple way that I've sort of come up with from some of my Jungian work is you got your material, and then you put a pattern on it. So you got your mother, and you got your potter, you got your pattern. And it's that tension between undifferentiated material, which for me, the trees, or painters would be the paint. You can choose any color, any mixture of colors. So you have undifferentiated, almost chaotic reality. And then out of that, something happens, something either spiritual or intuitive happens, and you begin to create a pattern and a form. And then the next steps of that, of course, would be to destroy it and start again, because it's an organic process. It's not really a linear or terminal process.
All right. That makes sense. My first question to myself when I was looking through this book was, why would he want to write such a detail-oriented compendium, which no doubt took him a very, very long time to research without the help of the internet and new technology on a topic that was so complex?
Yeah.
Because the topic is in many ways off the beaten path. I mean, see, even back then, it wasn't exactly mainstream magic and that. And now it isn't either, for that matter. We're not completely mainstream either. And the interesting part is that the book is considered an occult classic and has never been out of print for the past 70 years. And that's some kind of track record for something that isn't, interesting to the masses.
Yeah, just great point. Just the modeling of that. So first of all, he was a bibliophile. He loved kind of haunting flea markets and booksellers all over Europe before the war, before World War II. And he kept in touch with them after the war, and when he would visit, he would go back to Europe to visit. So he had this phenomenal both taste and quality of books in his life. And so he bought and bought and bought. So he had access, and it was kind of almost a missionary activity where he was saving these books, and he was collecting, and Cornell University came swooping in just shortly after he died and said, we must have this collection. And the whole collection is up in Ithaca, New York, at Cornell at this point, and it's a real jewel in their library collection. So one, he was a dogged researcher. And so he had that kind of dedication that, you could only compare to the internet and Google at this point.
Mm-hmm. Well, and he had to be an avid historian, too, because this isn't, some people write books on history and they go back 100 years or they'll stick to one time period and move on. This book starts, at day one practically and keeps going till the 18th century. It's so complex and so much information that it kind of made my head hurt to kind of think about compiling it and researching and putting it all together. I mean, yes, it's put together on a timeline, but there are so many things involved that he had to have such an amazing love of history. I
had a similar experience, Marla, of how to consume the book, and I've gotten earlier copies of it, which were kind of, used copies which you could find in bookstores for $1 or $2. They were smaller, and the drawings in them, they were the same drawings they were in this book, but they were muddier because it had been recopied so many times. So this particular book is a larger format, and the drawings they just jump out at you. But I would just open it up. I think it's called bibliomancy. You just open something up, and it's the page you should be on. Do you understand? So that always helped me. Or I would just follow my interest, the interest in alchemy, so there were some areas that I was much more interested in personally, and I would just, start in the middle of the book and read that way.
Well, I'm going to tell you about bibliomancy and this book because you mentioned it when we were talking last time. So I didn't much pay attention. This book also has a lovely red ribbon bookmark in it that's attached. This is really good. So after you had said that, I said, I'm going to try this. So I had opened the book to where the bookmark was at that time. And those not familiar with that form of divination, it's where a person opens a book at random and it puts a finger on it, with your eyes closed or whatever, but you start reading the first words that catch your eye. So I grabbed my copy of the book and I opened it for the first time where the bookmark was, and I found it in the chapter on the Middle Ages, and the subhead was the Arabs. And that talks about the message that Muhammad carried into the Arabic world in the 7th century, and how before his coming, the Arabs lived and died with magic. They spoke to the good genies and the jinns, and they used charms and wax figures, incantations. And after Muhammad had established a new faith, the Arabs continued with their magical practices as before, but they added to their incantations some verses from the Quran. And in that way, they employed the power of religion together with that of traditional magic. So now you might ask, what did I get from that? But it's pretty simple. It's kind of what I always say. People can practice magic or the craft or whatever they want to call it, and they don't have to give up their personal belief system to do so. I mean, I know Christian druids, I know Jewish witches, so maybe the message of this particular bibliomancy session was to repeat that message again. I see my life is one, well, it's actually more spiritual than religious, but religion and spirituality also go hand in hand. You don't have to give up one for the other. So I think that was my message. The message came from Muhammad. The mountain didn't come to Muhammad. Muhammad came to us, and we got the bibliomancy thing done. But it's really kind of fascinating, and that's an excellent book to do that with.
Yeah.
Because there is so much in there. It boggles the mind.
You know, I was just thinking of where you opened, and just in a larger national or international context, you know, the importance of what you just said, you know, that not polarizing things having to be either or, but things can be both.
Right.
And you can mix things together. And that's a hard lesson we're having to relearn right now in culture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is. So, you know, I mean, things happen for a reason. We divine things, divination, and if you think hard enough about it, because at first glance I thought, the Arabs, what is that? I didn't think about it, but got to be really pretty clear at that. Mm-hmm. All right. Now, before getting to the book, I was not familiar with Seligman's work, and I decided to poke around the internet to see some of his paintings, and I kind of wondered if he did a lot of magical topics, and I was looking to see if he had a collection of perhaps magical paintings that might have been exhibited in any galleries, and I came across an article 4 years ago that he made something like $262,000, which is an artist record at the Surrealist Art Evening Sale at Sotheby's in London. And they featured a photo of one of his works from the 1950s in the article called The Witches. And I loved that. It was amazing. And I'm not, you know, a very knowledgeable in art in certain cases, but he also created, I looked up, The Alchemy of Painting in 1955, or he created The Alchemy of Painting in 1955. And it seems likely that it said that he kind of came to view a painting as a kind of alchemical transformation of pigments and paint, and that he was also drawn to etchings which used numerous chemicals and acids to create the plates. And a few years earlier, he had created The Alchemist's Muse in somewhat the same style, and then 1949 made a painting showing two surrealist alchemists in their laboratory working with flasks. And as I said, I wasn't familiar with his works, but the thing that got to me, the surrealist technique is very wonderful and amazing. But in looking over so many of his paintings over the years, I really fell in love with his use of color. Maybe that's pretty shallow, but the color that he works into his art is subtle but dynamic at the same time.
Yeah, it jumps. First of all, I'm just amazed at your encyclopedic hunting that you've done here. You've mentioned a number of paintings that I'm not familiar with. His use of color was one of his skills. He was also a skilled engraver, and we still have, you know, I'm over at his homestead now, which is a small kind of museum-like area. We still have his press that he printed on, and we actually have refurbished it, and we have found some of his plates out in the yard, out in the property, and lots of tubes of his paint that were just all thrown out after he died. So it's just, you know, things just sort of float around the universe here. And I'm going to have to look up a couple of those paintings you mentioned, the titles that I was not familiar with. I'm going to have to look those up. That sounds very interesting.
Yeah, I was just, you know, I thought maybe he did kind of a collection of magical things, and they popped up. I mean, there were more, but those two were the ones that kind of hit me. So there is a theme going here about magic in his works, and it was kind of neat. But now, okay, so I suppose the most obvious question is, how did you get involved with the Seligman Center and the book?
I live in the town next to where this place is, where Sugarloaf, New York is, where he had his 55 acres. Mm-hmm. And it was it's a mysterious kind of place because it doesn't have any signs up. It's owned by a different kind of not-for-profit right now, and so it was. And I just happened to be there a number of times, and you could feel the energy of the place. He and his wife are buried under a huge ash tree there, mm-hmm. so that you don't have to be particularly skilled in picking up energy to figure out there's something going on here. Mm-hmm. The land itself is unusual. It's wetlands, highlands. In 55 acres, it just covers, from the water to springs to upper fields. So it takes your breath away. We have views of mountains where the local Indians perform sacred ceremonies. So it's definitely a thin place. Do you know that term, that Celtic term?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I felt that when I was there. And then I'd look around the offices there, which were for quite a different reason, and I'd find all of a sudden there's a drawer full of letters from Kurt Seligman to various people. So lots of his material is still there, and up in closets there were paintings. And so I just sort of said, what is all this? And they said, oh, this is who we got this place from. So I got a bunch of my artist friends together, and I said, do you know what's 10 miles from us here? So there's been about 15 of us that have kind of organized this and done shows there and just tried to raise his profile a little bit back in the world. And so it's been great fun. It's been half a detective story and half a treasure hunt.
Mm-hmm. You just kind of lucked into it in a sense, or, yes. Well, all right, from a medical standpoint, you were meant to. You didn't luck into it. There's no such thing as luck in that respect. But that had to have just kind of taken a new leaf, turned a new page in your life once you started to get involved like that.
Actually, it did. I stopped doing the furniture I was doing. And I don't know, I'm not attributing anything to cause and effect here, but things flow in certain ways.
Yes.
And I started carving objects rather than making chairs. So I was a craftsman, I was a builder, and I've spent the last 10 or 15 years carving what I call anima, little witchy spirit figures out of bark that I pick up in the Hudson.
Nice.
So surrealism at that point was really an important part. And it was also surrealists really were practicing Jungians at that point. Jung was all about active imagination and developing methods for getting in conversation with your unconscious. And the surrealists were doing the same thing. They were developing methods, blowing paint through tubes, pounding things. Much more physical, but it was all honoring accident, honoring coincidence. So it was a very rich time. Those 40s and 50s were a very creatively rich time, and you can still feel it reverberating.
I can imagine the atmosphere there would be so peacefully comfortable, yet busy at the same time, if that makes sense. Now, one thing that probably keeps things alive, so to speak, was the fact that not only that he's buried there, but he had a rather tragic death, an early tragic death there. Care to share?
Yeah, it's still, lots of people claim they know exactly what the story was, but it was one not too long. It was a January day, not unlike this one. And 1962, he was 62 years old. He had retired from teaching a couple years before because of some heart ailments. And again, so he's moving into his 60s. and aging is another whole kind of quadrant of life that has its own ways and rules. Surrealism was not as popular or frothy as it had been in the 40s. So that's a sort of a little bit of background. It was a January morning. He was supposedly going to get a new canvas roof on his convertible, and he saw some rats out at his bird feeder, went out to shoot them with the gun, and slipped, and the gun went off and killed him. And if you know about surrealism, you know that there are long discussions among surrealists and articles and about the validity of suicide, and that it's the Kay Sage, for instance, who was a dear friend of Seligman's, committed suicide, I think, 5 years later. So suicide was definitely a topic they all talked about. But I talked to the man who found Seligman, who was actually supposed to go with him that morning. And most everyone I talked to say it was not a suicide, and it would be a pretty bizarre suicide, even for a surrealist, to try to shoot yourself with a rifle. So I think it was an accident, but it was one of those kind of odd accidents that make for great stories.
Yeah, and it's a tragedy no matter how it happened. If it's suicide, it's terrible. If it's accidental, even worse maybe at that point. He was
writing a follow-up to this book. He was revising his book as he was doing that. So that to me, when I found that out, and I only found that out relatively recently, that's enough. I mean, I've been working on this book for a long time, and it feeds you to do this kind of work. And so I would sort of be on the accident side of it, like everyone says, but you sort of keep turning it around to see. But yeah, I would be so curious to see what a revised version of this book would look like.
I can't even imagine what more he could have put in.
Yeah.
I mean, he could have gone later, after the 18th century, could have done the 19th and depending on how long he lived, he could have gone in that direction. But it is so full of information that I can't even see where you could throw something in. And
what we did find was some typewritten lectures that he gave at the New School. So he taught at Brooklyn College. He taught at the New School, at Pratt. He taught. There's always, that's who he was. So he had. I'm digressing, but this is. He had several different identities. Many of the surrealists were just painters and just focusing on their work, their shows, their dealers. And I think that there was a balance in Seligman that was very interesting, an egoic balance. And it kept him, I think, on the B list of artists, that his teaching was as important to him as his painting, as his land, as his wife. So there was, there was not that monomaniacal focus that some artists like Dali, for instance, had, or Duchamp, or Breton.
It just kind of, it's mind-boggling. I mean, I didn't know what I was getting into when I said I wanted this book, from the publisher. I mean, it looked interesting, but oh my God, it's opened so many thought processes in my head and so many different new things coming at me in all directions that it's really amazing. Just, again, I'm not going to say it wasn't meant to be. It probably was, but let's talk a little bit about the artwork in the book, because as I mentioned, the book was first published, and you mentioned too, in 1948. And it was the time of kind of people were seeking things. I mean, history of magic and occult was around, but it was kind of seeking, the book, from what I read, was kind of seeking to mirror the magical world view through the ages. And so the newly released collector's edition features all of the original artwork, more than 255 images from the original edition. But I think, as you told me the other day, There were other editions before now, but the artwork got kind of muddy. You know, it kind of lost dimension. You know, they weren't very well done because they were like copies of copies of copies, several
Right.
generations down. So in this new book, I mean, the artwork is in pristine form, isn't it?
Yeah, it's very beautiful. And so you can feel, and it came from his collection. Most of the images came from his collection. And that's why it's unusual, you know, to find woodcuts, engravings. So he knew what he was looking at. So to have an artist collect and write a book, it's a double advantage. And then so you can see what images he valued, and you can get a hit off them.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, some of these images date back to the 13th century that he used. And it must have been, again, a monumental job to compile. You know, forget the history and the writing. I mean, just looking for these or gathering these. And some are quite compelling and some are very informational. I mean, this is an excellent example of show and tell, because each image, as you're reading, you just look at the image and it's hand to glove or hand in glove or however you put it. Yeah, it's absolutely a gem of he's created a gem in a book form because there's just so many different aspects to it. You know what I think?
I've been thinking about this. He's not trying to sell you something. He's not trying to sell you one brand of magic. So that's where you're not feeling this hot breath on your neck. Mm-hmm. You know, do you want this? Do you want this? Do you want this?
Right.
So that there's that teacherly approach of just laying out the buffet of images and words, and you get to sort of poke around and pick this and pick that. So there's a very genteel quality to it, which you don't often find in this kind of accelerated world we live in now.
Mm-hmm. And, you know, you don't have to be interested in magic per se to enjoy this book because of the history in it. Okay, the timeline in the book begins in Mesopotamia. And every chapter draws you in from the very beginning. So from this opening chapter in the book, because I just want to kind of prove that point, the chapter begins by saying, from time immemorial, man has felt confronted with evil, supernatural beings, and his weapons against them have always been magical rites. People's minds were dominated by malign beings who demanded sacrifices and prayers. But the sages of ancient civilizations also knew that good spirits existed, ever ready to come to the rescue of the afflicted. Amid such fears and wonders lived the river people of the Tigris and the Euphrates. I mean, you know, it'll grab you really, really quickly. It's not like you're studying a history book, like, you know, we would do in school. We'd skim over it and just try to get the highlights. His opening sentences for each paragraph, for each chapter and the subheads, will draw you in, even when you think you're not interested in that particular thing. I mean, there are going to be things that people aren't going to, you know, say, okay, well, let me skip to something else, because it's a great book to skip around and find what interests you. But no matter where you go, I mean, you know, from there, he goes through Persia, the Hebrews, Egypt, Greece, the Roman Empire, the Middle Ages, and into the 18th century. And along the way, he covers things like witchcraft, the devil, diabolic rites, the magical arts, principles of alchemy. He talks about people like Roger Bacon or Agrippa, Nostradamus, and that's just the very tip. I mean, it's crazy how much is in that book. And I said, well, it is a big book, but amazing. And so, all right, so I picked up a short list of topics that totally caught my eye when looking through the table of contents. And they were things like Egyptian mortuary magic, famous transmutations, that's in the alchemy chapter. In the witchcraft chapter, just about everything. There's nothing in this book that I said didn't interest me on one level or another, and it draws you in. Okay, here's the great story that got me at the first page of the witchcraft chapter. And because the witchcraft chapter starts with possessions. and he tells this I think it's a sweet story, by Gregory the Great, telling of the servant who swallowed the devil by inadvertently eating a leaf of lettuce that the devil had been sitting on. Now, that just made me smile. Honest to God. These kinds of things are all through the book, these little things that you're not expecting to see. I've never heard that story. But, oh, my God, it is a sweet, wonderful story. It gives you this mental image of a little guy with a pitchfork, in hand, and the tail and the horns, and he's sitting, for God knows why, on a leaf of lettuce. And more importantly, she picked it up and ate it. Didn't he have time to jump off? So this is what makes his book so very, very interesting.
Yeah, he's not breathy in what he's. Yeah, when I said, he's not trying to sell you anything. So your tone of voice here is wonderful. You got to discover the kind of pleasure points of the book for yourself.
Uh-huh. Yeah. So what were some of your pleasure points?
Certainly the alchemy area, and also learning more about Paracelsus, and alchemy. Let me see. I have it right here.
While you're looking at that, Kat in chat room said, well, deviled ham goes good on lettuce.
That's funny.
Thank you, Kat.
Oh.
I love my chat room.
I think I'm really... and then there's a chapter on the magical arts also that I like.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm coming at the book from a very kind of practical, I was a craftsman, and I've sort of come to this world of magic and occult a little later in life. So the kind of when it's tied to objects and procedures, I get a little more comfortable with it.
Mm-hmm. Well, and there are lots of, like, I'm looking right now through some of the illustrations, and there's lots of little things that have been, carved in, wood carvings and wood, whatever. I mean, it's just really kind of something that would get to you too, certain pictures. I mean, I love some of the older pictures from the 13th century of people, know, and that. But the other thing, too, that was interesting, I don't know if you read this, I didn't read it completely, but famous transmutations.
Remind me.
Well, that it came in medieval alchemy, and oh my God, the writing it's dark in here, I can't read. But they talk about this man talked about the present stage of chemistry does not allow us to consider impossible the transmutation of metals from notions recently acquired and from current character of chemistry, and we may assume that the transformation of one metal into another could be attained. So I guess it's the alchemy part of it, and then he's going into other things. But, I mean, there's just, flip a page and everything just jumps out at you. Okay, I need to write that. I mean, I need to read this. I wanted to write that. He talks about Matthew Hopkins, the Witchfinder General. I didn't see that before. Yeah, that was not a good guy. Not a good guy at all. But so that, there is something for everybody in here, and some of it is fun, some of it is interesting. I mean, he's talking about different types of divination. That's in the magical arts category. Mm-hmm. A lovely illustration of the lines of the hand, palmistry.
Yes, right. And the shapes of heads.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. Well, divination in all different forms, like when people used to read bumps on people's heads to see, how they were getting along. Good thing that somebody haven't got knocked. But there's a lot about astrology in here. There's a lot about the Kabbalah. Like I said, I just, it's amazingly wonderful how much you can put into one book, and that's why I'm having trouble even trying to figure out what more he could have put into it.
Yeah, well, that's where I was starting. I think I forgot what I was saying earlier, that we found a bunch of lectures that he did at the New School on topics like magic or space, or let's see, there were 3 or 4. I mean, we found a dozen. We've published a bunch of zines at the Sullivan Center, and in the one on magic, he talks about, and I've never seen this. Maybe Marla, you know, from philosophy where this came from, but he just in the middle of his lecture, I'm reading it on onion skin paper, with red ribbon and black ribbon and handwritten. He talks about 3 forms of reality: perceived reality, remembered reality, and imagined reality, and that's what our life experience is. And I just sort of stopped. I said, wow, that helical spin of those, we're never, we wonder why we're in a fog sometimes. And, what parts of reality have you gotten in touch with? And, I wonder if it's Platonic or if it's Aristotelian, this idea of this kind of refracted sense of reality.
Well, and imagined reality, the minute you said that, sounds like an oxymoron. How can something imagined be real?
Mm-hmm.
So that would be an interesting thing to ponder too.
It might be almost like ancestral karma. It's something that you've come in with,
right?
That you didn't really have a lot of control over.
So maybe imagined is not really imagined reality. Maybe it is once upon a time reality that you think about now and don't realize that maybe you've been there, done that before.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
See, this book makes you think, and not in a bad way. Some people say, I don't want a book that makes me think.
Oh, that's the other thing, that lots of books go kind of horizontally. This book moves up and down vertically. Mm-hmm. That he's not afraid to get into kind of personal, not his own personal things, but touching you personally. And that's what struck me as kind of a valuable thing. It's not simply, and you mentioned this earlier, it's not just simply a history of recounting facts of who did what when, but he usually the sentences, and again, English was not his first language, but there's a remarkable subtlety to the way he uses English to kind of imply kind of subtle emotional states.
Mm-hmm. I just got distracted for 1 second because
I heard that.
I flipped a page, and it's an illustration, the occult affinities between the animal world and the vegetable world. That is really, really interesting. There are plants, looks like an anthurium and some other things, and then you have like a bull with horns. You have a sheep with the curled horns. You've got the unicorn there.
What page are you on?
I am on 334 is where the pictures are.
Can you carry this book by yourself, or do you need a friend to help carry it with you?
I have to use both hands, and I have to hold it close.
Okay.
Because otherwise it will weigh me down. I'm not very tall to begin with. So.
I see this page now. Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah, isn't it? The animals and vegetables. And I heard... I listened to a little bit of an interview that you did, I think in October, and you said that this was not particularly a comfortable book to hang on to while you're reading. You want to talk about that? Because it kind of made me laugh. I got a big picture of a big tall man being sidelined by a book. Yeah. Yeah,
you don't snuggle up with this book. I've learned to read it on a desk.
Mm-hmm.
How many pages? What
almost 500.
500, right? And it's oversized, so they're not small pages. So
right.
Yeah, so it's a presence.
Mm-hmm. It is, and you said it was just like, well, I think you tried to pick it up like a real book in the beginning just to see if you could hold it. Not thinking that it was going to be any more of a challenge than any other book, right?
Yeah, no, it has it has several weights, and its poundage is only one of them. It's also filled with lots of interesting stuff. But I'm big. I'm 210 pounds, so I really can pick it up. But I honor it by putting it down and keeping it. It's like you've seen Jung's Red Book. Have you seen that? It's huge. I mean, it's half the size of a desk, so.
Yeah. Anyway, I just had to mention that because I thought that was funny. It gave me a good mental image, and the laugh was on you that time. All right, Kat in the chat room, going back to imagined reality. There's a quote: "Some men see things as they are and say why. I dream things that never were and say why not," which was a quote from President John F. Kennedy. So that could be another example of imagined reality.
Yeah, that's very good.
Mm-hmm.
And also, just again, the thumbnail description of what magic is just unseen forces.
Yeah.
So how much control you have. So that's really what imagined reality is too. It's like you can't perceive it, you can't really remember it, but you know it's there. Mm-hmm. This is March in the East right now, so it's very windy, and it's going to be March. I'm going out with a bunch of kids in March because it's windy. I'm just setting up these little classes, and we just take a big tarp out with us, and we just let ourselves blow all over with the wind. So getting in touch with unseen forces is a good practice to sort of kind of tone up your magic antenna. It would be wind, it would be sometimes temperature, things you can't see but you can feel, and that they have their correlatives in emotions also. But you sort of put yourself in take small risks with weather, and that helps kind of tune you up other ways.
Mm-hmm. And this is what kind of saddens me. There are people that don't believe anything that they can't hold in their hand, and you miss out so much in life because not everything is tangible, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. So it's just like I keep saying this over and over at times, that you can't just live in the black and white. You need to live in the gray, because that's where all the possibilities are.
All right, so there we have some political challenge. What do we offer people who choke on that? If they can't measure it, if they can't see it, they don't want anything to do with it. So we have to, as kind of spiritual warriors, we have to figure out ways, and usually indirect ways, of having people come in contact with forces that maybe we're more comfortable with and that would scare them if they hit them head on. Mm-hmm. So we have to devise kind of subtle ways to do that.
Oh. Well, yeah. I just, there are people who are skeptical, and then there are people who are cynical. And the skeptics will listen. But the cynics, I don't care what you do, they're not going to believe anything that they don't already know. And so, it's, in paganism, we don't try to tell you to do this or do that or join us or do, there's no dogma, there's nothing. And we don't recruit. And if you don't like what we do, that's fine. We embrace you and everybody else that does what other things. But it's really hard to deal with someone who is so cynical that they don't have any kind of imagination, don't want any kind of imagination. They're probably afraid from somebody taught them something. If you can't see it, it doesn't exist, because whoever taught them that was afraid too, or maybe saw something that didn't exist and scared the bejesus out of them. You never know.
Yeah, I spend a lot of time thinking about this and how so you can. I'm 70 now, so I'm sort of at that end of. I'm in a quadrant of life, or a stage of life that it was only theoretical for a while. So, how do you reorganize yourself? And this can be done at any time you find yourself in a transition. How do you organize yourself against sort of the loss of standing that you've had, the loss of visibility? And it's figuring out what you do have and how you can work with that. And it takes a deep breath, but there are four needs usually that keep changing as you age through life. We have the need for standing, telling stories about who we are, what we do, what we think. Oh, the funniest thing happened today. We're storytelling animals. We also have the need for joy or wonder. Just, oh my God, look at that sky, look at that moon. So you have to be sort of struck by awe, and I think that's a need. We have the need to make things, to feel that we're capable, that we're competent. So that's where a lot of, I'll fix that, or what you need here, lady, is a new. And so I spent years as a rustic furniture builder, And the fourth one is the most intriguing for me. We have the need to be in touch with nature. And that's a kind of milquetoast way to put it. But a nicer way, or a more real way to put it, is we have a need to be feral. And there are parts of us, especially if you're pagan, you know all this. But it scares a lot of people that there are feral, that there's a feral component to them, and that it has to be fed. That it's a need, and there's ways to do that. You can watch, fighting or sports, or you can watch some sort of feral activity, or you can begin to participate in your own feral nature in certain ways. But recognizing that you have these hungers or these needs is very important. And sometimes when I'm talking with larger groups of people who, I'll talk about symptoms. Are you and it's almost like, are you tired more? Are you this way more? So if I can list a number of symptoms, I at least get their interest because I've described how they're feeling. And then I can begin to talk about some other things.
Yeah. We're running short of time now. I told you it was going to happen. But I want you to just give out your website where people can find you, and also the Seligman Centers as well.
I would just suggest typing it into one of the search engines, either the Seligman Center or Kurt Seligman. I think we're the first 2 or 3 to come up there, and you can see a lot of his pictures, his imagery. Learn more about him, some of the activities. If you're in the larger New York City area, we're about 50 miles north of New York. And my website, again, is my name, Daniel Mack. And this book that I've been dragging around with me for 20 years, it's another website called The Casual Alchemist.
Perfect. All right, I got to thank you so much for being here tonight. And just a quick note, wait a minute, it went away for a second, but Cece in chat room, she said, "Thank you, Marla. I just ordered the book, and it will be my weightlifting workout." There you go. So thank you, Cece, for that. All right. Stay on the line, Daniel, when we're off, and I'll thank you properly. And for everybody listening in, thank you for being here, as always. And until next time, everybody, blessed be, and merry meet again. Good night.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Stirring the Cauldron with Marla Brooks. Please join us again next week at the same time for another great guest and more cauldron stirring. Any rebroadcast or other use of this program without explicit permission is strictly prohibited. Copyright 2018. The Path of the Goblin King by Kevin MacLeod is licensed through Incompetech.com.